Have you ever imagined what it would be like to live for 930 years? Before the Great Flood erased all traces of the old world, some people lived for centuries, embodying the shadow of eternity and the haunting inevitability of death. Adam, the first man ever created, lived 930 years before returning to the dust. The following generations, Seth, Enoch, Kenan, lived hundreds of years, witnessing a world increasingly filled with sin, violence, and darkness. But amidst the flow of names and years, a strange story began to unfold: a divine judgment, a cataclysmic flood, and an ark of salvation drifting on endless waters. One man alone was chosen to walk with God in this darkness: Noah. Yet, as the waters receded, was the new world truly cleansed? Noah's descendants, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, became the roots of humanity, each branch carrying its legacy of reverence, dishonor, and divine judgment. Their stories etched themselves deeply into history, raising an unsettling question: what happens when a new world is born, but the shadows of the past refuse to vanish? Join us as we turn the pages of the Book of Genesis, where life and death, hope and curse intertwine in mystery. If you find value in this video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel to explore more profound biblical stories with us. Let us begin with the origins of mankind and the lineage of Adam. Be sure to subscribe to catch part 3 of our series, Shocking Hidden Mysteries in Genesis. When darkness still veiled the earth and the world was a desolate void, God, the Almighty Creator, spoke the words that marked the beginning of all life: "Let there be mankind." And from the dust of the ground, humanity was formed. Yet, they were not mere creations. God made them in His image, a marvel so extraordinary that it surpasses the imagination of modern times. In every breath, in every drop of blood coursing through their veins, there seemed to be a sacred fragment of the Creator. He called them by a simple yet powerful name: man. Blessing them, God envisioned the future of humanity, where life would flourish like an undying flame. They were created male and female, two forms in harmony, symbolizing the balance of the world. Yet, hidden within that perfection, time lay as an unseen adversary, destined to return all things to dust. Even so, in those primordial days, humanity seemed to possess something extraordinary, a secret that allowed them to live far beyond what we can fathom today. 930 years, that was the lifespan of Adam, the first man. Adam walked the earth as a witness to an era, beholding the rise and spread of his kind. At 130, he fathered a son, whom he named Seth, in his likeness. After his image, Seth was not merely a son but a perfect reflection of Adam, a testament to his enduring strength and lineage. Seth was the link between Adam and the generations to come, carrying within him a fragment of eternity. But time marched on. After Seth's birth, Adam lived another 800 years, during which he fathered many sons and daughters. They grew and spread, multiplying across the earth. One can imagine a vast, ancient tree with countless branches spreading outward, with Adam as its sturdy, original trunk. At the age of 930, Adam died. His passing was not just a death. It was the closing chapter of a legend of strength and long life. Seth, Adam's heir, lived in the shadow of his father's great legacy. Yet, he, too, became a figure of legend. At 105 years old, Seth fathered Enoch. People often say each successive generation is a faint echo of the one before, but this lineage defied that rule. After Enoch was born, Seth lived another 807 years, a staggering number that evokes awe at such longevity. In total, Seth lived for 912 years. When Seth died, the world passed into the hands of Enoch. Born in an age where human lifespans were still extraordinary, at 90 years old, Enoch fathered Kenan. In those days, 90 was not the mark of old age, but the dawn of a life yet to be fully lived. Like his forebears, Enoch fathered many sons and daughters, further extending the ever-growing branches of this great family tree. By the time of his death at 905 years old, even Enoch, who lived almost a millennium, could not escape the shadow of death. Kenan, son of Enoch, continued this quiet but magnificent mission. At 70 years old, Kenan became the father of Methuselah. His name was etched into the annals of this lineage, an inseparable part of Adam's descendants. After Methuselah was born, Kenan lived another 840 years, witnessing countless generations of his offspring rise and thrive. When he died at 910 years old, those stark numbers once again raised the question, how could they live so long? Then came Methuselah, bearing the weight of this mysterious lineage. At 65 years old, he fathered Jared. Once again, the numbers astound. In Methuselah's time, 65 was the beginning of a long journey. After Jared's birth, Methuselah lived another 830 years, fathering countless sons and daughters, as if this sacred bloodline would never cease. When he passed away at 895 years old, another chapter of this extraordinary story ended. What explains these astonishing lifespans? Did early humanity possess some divine secret, a strength bestowed by God that we have since lost? Or was there something about the pristine, untouched environment of those ancient times, free from pollution and decay, that allowed them to endure? These questions linger, unanswered. The eerie and haunting aspect of this story lies in one undeniable truth. No matter how long they lived, 930 years, 912 years, or 905 years, they all died. Death spared no one, not Adam, nor Seth, nor Methuselah. A strange paradox emerges. Humanity lived almost eternally, yet they still faced an end. Was this a reminder from the Creator that nothing truly endures except for Him? This chapter is far more than a genealogy or a dry list of numbers. It is a legend, a metaphor for life and death, and a reminder that no matter how far humanity advances, we remain bound by time and fate. Names like Adam, Seth, Enoch, Kenan, and Methuselah are not just ancestors of a lineage. They are witnesses of an ancient age where human lifespans stretched beyond the limits of our imagination. Whether we believe it or not, this story remains an enduring mystery, an enigma beyond resolution. Perhaps, within our veins, a trace of that sacred lineage still lingers, reminding us that we, though small, carry the mark of a time long forgotten. Listen closely. Among these numbers and tales, do you hear it? It is the echo of the beginning, the whisper of souls who lived nearly 1,000 years, reminding us that life is sacred and death is inevitable. Jared, the descendant of Methuselah, was the next figure in this extraordinary lineage. At the age of 162, a number that stirs awe as it merely marked the beginning of his life, he became the father of Enoch. In an era when childbirth was imbued with sacred significance, Enoch emerged as a promise, a prelude to something far more mysterious. Jared lived an additional 800 years and fathered countless sons and daughters. His life resembled a mighty tree, its roots firmly planted in the earth, its branches stretching far beyond the horizon. Yet, like all those before him, Jared ultimately succumbed to the call of the shadows. He lived a total of 962 years before breathing his last, leaving the world to Enoch, his son, who history would remember forever. Enoch was unlike anyone who came before him. At the age of 65, He became the father of Methuselah. But what made Enoch legendary was not his lifespan, but his profound and mysterious connection with God. Enoch walked faithfully with God for 300 years, a devotion so absolute that it stood unparalleled. It was said that Enoch's step echoed with prayers, and every breath he drew was filled with sacred purpose. Then, something miraculous happened, something unprecedented and never to be repeated. At 365 years old, Enoch vanished from the earth. The scriptures state, Enoch walked faithfully with God. Then he was no more because God took him away. It was said that Enoch did not taste death. Instead, God, moved by his absolute devotion, took him to heaven. The image of Enoch fading like a mist left the world in awe and fear. He was the only one in Adam's lineage to escape the grasp of death. Was unwavering faith the key to eternity? Or was Enoch chosen to bear witness to something beyond human understanding? This mystery remains an enigma, but the story continues. After Enoch, Methuselah, his son, stepped onto the stage of time. At 187 years old, Methuselah became the father of Lamech. Methuselah is a figure shrouded in intrigue, for his life spanned an unimaginable length, bordering on immortality. After Lamech's birth, Methuselah lived another 782 years, fathering sons and daughters and expanding his enduring lineage. In total, Methuselah lived 969 years, the longest lifespan recorded in human history. Whispers of legend surround Methuselah, sparking unease. Did he witness the world's transformation from innocence to decay? Was he the last living testament of an era nearing its end? When he finally passed, the world seemed to grow quieter, as if something monumental loomed ahead. Then came Lamech, Methuselah's son, who carried the legacy forward. At 182 years old, he fathered a son named Noah. This name was more than a mere designation. It carried a prophecy, a hope. Lamech declared, "He will comfort us in the labor and painful toil of our hands caused by the ground the Lord has cursed." These words echoed as a warning, as though Lamech sensed an impending calamity lurking in the shadows, a great event poised to engulf the world. After Noah's birth, Lamech lived an additional 595 years, fathering many more sons and daughters. His life spanned 777 years, a number that seemed like an omen, a sign of completion, and a new beginning. When Lamech closed his eyes for the final time, the world had already shifted, and all eyes turned to Noah, the son who bore the hope of humanity. Noah, the last name in this profound chapter, marked the beginning of a new era, one where the heavens would roar, and the floodwaters would engulf all. At the age of 500, Noah became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These three sons were not merely Noah's descendants. They were the seeds of a renewed world, one that would rise from ruins and despair. The lineage of Adam, from Adam to Seth, from Enoch to Methuselah, and finally to Noah, is a saga of unparalleled grandeur and somber mystery. Behind each seemingly dry number lies stories of life that stretched far beyond human limits, of death that waited silently, and of secrets known only to God. Enoch, who walked faithfully with God and was taken without tasting death. Methuselah, the longest living man in history, is a towering monument of the ancient world. Noah, the chosen one, is destined to carry humanity's hope and bring solace to a cursed world. Is this lineage, with its extraordinary lifespans and lives marked by prophecy, a reminder of humanity's connection to the Creator? Have we, as time has passed and the world changed, lost the strength our ancestors once held? Or is it a sign of an era drawing to its end, a time when humans lived for nearly a millennium before the scythe of fate severed the thread of eternity? In the pages of history, the story of Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, and Noah forms an epic of beginnings and endings. Each name, each number, is a cryptic message from the past, a reminder of how close humanity once was to eternity and how, in the shadow of death, we come to understand the sacredness of life. Before the flood swept everything away, when the earth was filled with life and the laughter of humanity, darkness had already begun to creep into the hearts of men. In those days, mankind multiplied and spread across the face of the earth. Among them, the daughters of humanity grew in beauty, their radiance captivating all who beheld them. It was then that something extraordinary occurred. The sons of God, beings not of this earthly realm, powerful and divine, saw the beauty of the daughters of humanity. They could not resist this allure and chose whomever they desired to take as their own, a sacred violation descending from the heavens. This union was more than love or possession. It was a convergence of two worlds, divine and mortal, spirit and flesh. From this union was born a mysterious race, the Nephilim. These giants, heroes of the ancient world, became renowned across the land. They possessed not only immense strength, but also pride and arrogance that shook the heavens and the earth. Yet their greatness brought neither peace nor joy to humanity. Instead, it ushered in darkness as wickedness and violence erupted everywhere. God looked down upon the earth and saw what human eyes could not perceive. How great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth. Every thought, every breath, and every beat of their hearts was consumed by evil, darkness, and greed. A profound sorrow gripped the Creator, and his wrath swelled like a tidal wave within him. I regret that I have made mankind on the earth. The voice of the Almighty declared judgment. Cold and absolute, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created. Yet his judgment extended beyond humanity. Even the innocent creatures, the birds of the air, the beasts of the field, and all that moved upon the ground, were to be destroyed. A harsh decree, like a consuming fire, threatened to obliterate all life. God's judgment did not come silently. It was heralded like a drumbeat echoing from heaven. Amid a world about to be engulfed by wrath, there remained one man, Noah, the last righteous soul. Among a generation consumed by madness and sin, Noah stood as a small yet steadfast flame in the unending darkness. He walked faithfully with God, unwavering in the face of ridicule and scorn. For this faith, Noah was chosen. God spoke to him, "Go into the ark, you and your whole family, because I have found you righteous in this generation." This command was not merely an opportunity to survive, but a test of faith and obedience. God entrusted Noah with a monumental mission, detailed to the smallest degree. He instructed him to bring 7 pairs of every clean animal, 1 pair of every unclean animal, and 7 pairs of birds to preserve life on earth. These living creatures would be the foundation for a new world after the coming deluge. The warning thundered like a storm breaking the darkened skies. 7 days from now, I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. Noah obeyed and did everything the Lord commanded him. Imagine a man, 600 years old, standing on dry land, diligently constructing an enormous ark of extraordinary dimensions, 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. While others mocked him as a madman, Noah pressed on, hammering each plank, his every strike marking the countdown to the world's end. When the 7 appointed days passed, the floodwaters came like the roar of a mighty beast. The day of reckoning arrived. Pairs of creatures began arriving from every direction as if drawn by a divine call echoing across the earth. Pairs of clean and unclean animals, birds, and all creatures that move along the ground, male and female, came to Noah. It was a miraculous and awe-inspiring sight. Tigers and lambs, eagles and sparrows, predators and prey, all marching in perfect order into the massive ark. On the 17th day of the second month of Noah's 600th year, the unimaginable occurred. The springs of the great deep burst forth as if the earth was weeping in anguish under the weight of divine judgment. The floodgates of the heavens were opened. Blackened clouds tore apart, unleashing torrents of rain like never before. Heaven and earth became one in a chaos unseen before. Rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights, ceaselessly, as though even the heavens mourned the fate of creation. Noah and his family, his wife, his sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives, entered the completed ark. They were not alone. Pairs of creatures from every corner of the earth, drawn by a divine command, filed into the ark. Pairs of clean and unclean animals, birds, and all creatures that move along the ground, male and female, came to Noah. It was a miraculous and almost terrifying scene. Lions and sheep, hawks and doves, all walking perfectly harmoniously into the massive vessel. When everything was ready, the Lord shut them in. The closing door marked the end, a final divide between life and death, between the faithful and the scoffers. As the ark's door closed, panic overtook the world outside. The floodwaters rose rapidly, consuming homes, trees, and hills. The waters swelled so high that even the tallest mountains under the heavens were submerged, covered by water over 20 feet deep. Every living thing on the face of the earth, birds, livestock, wild animals, all creatures that moved along the ground, and all mankind was wiped out. Everything on dry land that had the breath of life in its nostrils died. The cries of humanity were drowned by the roar of the waters. Those who once mocked Noah now flailed in desperation. But the wrath of God was unstoppable. Every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out. The earth was swept clean of the sinful and the proud. Amid the vast expanse of water, only Noah's ark remained, drifting like a small beacon in the infinite darkness. It floated upon the waters like a solitary fortress, carrying within it the world's future. Noah, his family, and the creatures on board survived, completely separated from the dying world outside. The floodwaters covered the earth for 150 days. The ark, gently rising and falling upon the endless sea, became a symbol of faith and divine protection. It was the stillness amid the storm, the hope in the depths of despair. While the old world was wiped away, God kept his promise to Noah. He and his family were the last seeds, the chosen ones destined to step into a renewed future when God's wrath subsided. The great flood was not merely a tale of destruction, but also one of renewal. Amid the pounding rain and rising waters, the earth was cleansed, washed of the sin and corruption humanity had brought. Noah's ark carried not only the remnants of life, but also the promise of a new beginning, a world where humanity would live in reverence and obedience to God. As the waters receded, a new world would emerge. But for now, in the shadow of the flood, in the eerie silence of the boundless waters, only Noah and those within the ark remained, a flickering light in a desolate world, a reminder that faith and devotion to God are the keys to overcoming the darkness and destruction. The rain had ceased, but the waters remained, a vast, unending sea that swallowed everything it touched. The world, once filled with laughter, the presence of humanity, and countless creatures, now lay submerged beneath the waters of death. Only Noah's massive ark drifted amidst the misty expanse, a lone fortress, the last note lingering in a symphony of destruction. Yet, in the stillness of this desolation, something had changed. As God looked down from the heavens, he had not forgotten what he had preserved. Within the ark, surrounded by darkness, the crashing of waves, and the labored breathing of hundreds of creatures. Noah and his family waited with steadfast patience. Then, like a gentle breath from the Creator's hand, a wind blew across the earth. It was more than a mere wind. It was a sign of life, of a new beginning. It was God's whisper, an invisible hand drawing back the waters to reveal the earth, barren and waiting to be reborn after the purging storm. The springs of the deep and the floodgates of the heavens were closed. The rain stopped, and no more water poured from the skies. The raging waters, like the immense hand of the divine, finally receded. Quietly and without fanfare, the waters began to withdraw from the earth. Yet the land, once drowned, remained shrouded and uncertain. The creatures aboard the ark could not know what awaited them beyond the horizon, nor could Noah discern when the earth would be ready to welcome life again. 150 days, an eternity in waiting, passed before the waters finally began to subside. The once furious waves, which had battered the ark, now sighed like an exhausted force spin at last. On the 17th day of the 7th month, Noah's ark came to rest. It settled on the mountains of Ararat, a towering peak amidst the boundless waters, as if chosen by God himself to cradle the vessel that carried the seeds of life. Time continued to pass, and the waters receded further. Slowly, beneath the retreating waves, the earth began to reveal itself, silent and mysterious. On the first day of the 10th month, the mountain peaks emerged like the ribs of a great creature rising from the endless depths. Imagine the scene, a vast, lifeless sea, now parting to expose dry land beneath a cold, gray sky. It was the first sign of renewal, but Noah waited still. 40 days later, with anticipation stirring within him, Noah approached the small window of the ark. He opened it and gazed out at the endless expanse of water. Releasing a raven, he sent it as a scout, a messenger to search for signs of life. The raven flew back and forth, circling over the waters, unable to find a place to land. It returned with no answer, a wandering soul without rest. Noah waited patiently and chose a dove this time, a symbol of peace and hope, fragile yet resolute. The dove took flight, its small wings beating against the vastness of the open sky. But the waters still covered the land, and the dove found no place to rest. It returned to Noah's waiting hands, and he gently took it back, holding on to the fragile hope that remained unfulfilled. Another 7 days passed, and Noah released the dove once more. His eyes followed it as it flew into the somber skies. As the day waned, the dove returned. In its beak was a tender olive leaf, fresh and green, glistening with the promise of life. Noah saw the leaf and understood that the waters had receded. The earth was beginning to reveal itself, and with it, the resurgence of life. A single olive leaf, small yet monumental, carried the weight of peace and the declaration that destruction had given way to renewal. Still, Noah waited. Another 7 days passed, and he released the dove again. This time, it did not return. Its small wings had found a resting place, a haven where it could begin anew. It was the final sign Noah needed. The world was ready. With tears in his eyes, Noah knew his journey was nearing its end. The breath of the wind, the wings of the dove, the mountains of Ararat, and the olive leaf, all were messages from God, assuring him that the earth was cleansed and prepared to receive the footsteps of life once more. In the vast, quiet expanse, the ark stood still atop the mountain, a monument to salvation. The rain had stopped, the waters had receded, and within Noah burned a hope for the new world. Just a little longer, he and all the creatures aboard would step out, touching the earth for the first time since the great flood. And so, from the ashes of destruction, the earth would be reborn. In the stillness, the whisper of the wind lingered, a promise, a final assurance of a new beginning. The sun cast its first rays upon the renewed earth, piercing through the fading storm clouds that once bore God's wrath. The roaring waves and relentless rains had ceased, replaced by an eerie silence. Time seemed to slow as Noah's massive ark rested on the slopes of Mount Ararat, a beacon of hope amidst the desolation. On the first day of the first month of Noah's 601st year, a miracle occurred. Noah, the man who carried the faith and destiny of the world on his shoulders, removed the covering from the ark. Light flooded in, revealing the dry ground below. The once dark, muddy earth that had drowned all life was now cracked and barren, ready to receive humanity's first steps again. The sunlight streaming through every crevice fulfilled God's promise. The floodwaters had receded. The earth was dry, and Noah's heart lifted, freed from the weight of hundreds of days confined within the silent ark. Yet, Noah waited. He did not rush, nor did he act hastily. He knew that everything must happen in God's perfect timing. Finally, on the 27th day of the second month, a day seemingly inscribed in the heavens, the earth was fully dry. No trace of the deluge remained. Only the cleansed land remained, still and pure, like a blank canvas awaiting the brushstrokes of new life. Then, the voice of God echoed, powerful yet filled with warmth. Come out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons and their wives. This was not just a command. It was a blessing, a call to freedom and renewal. The wooden walls of the ark, which had shielded them through the storm, now opened to release them into a world made new. Noah turned to his family, his wife, his sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives. Their faces, weary from the long journey, now glimmered with hope. Together, they descended from the ark, their feet touching the dry ground for the first time since the flood. It was as though they could feel the earth's warmth beneath their soles, a connection to the reborn land. They were not alone. Pairs of creatures, as divinely ordained, emerged from the ark. All the animals and all the creatures that move along the ground and all the birds, everything that moves on land, came out of the ark, one kind after another. The scene was both majestic and surreal. Lions walking alongside lambs, tigers and goats moving without conflict. Birds took to the clear skies, and wild beasts roamed freely, creating a symphony of creation's revival. The world, after its fierce cleansing, was beginning again. Noah stood amidst this awe-inspiring scene, his heart overflowing with emotion. He knew he could not step into this new world without offering thanks to the one who had preserved him and his family. With trembling but determined hands, he gathered clean animals and birds as God had instructed. There, on the newly dried ground, he built an altar. The fire blazed, its flames bright against the newly reborn earth. The animals were offered in sacrifice, and the smoke rose high, bridging the pristine earth and the heavens above. The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma. It was not merely the scent of the offering, but the fragrance of faithfulness, gratitude, and Noah's love for God. In that moment, God made a declaration in his heart, transforming judgment into an eternal promise. Never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. And never again will I destroy all living creatures, as I have done. These words resounded through creation, an oath etched into the fabric of existence itself. The earth, from that moment forward, would no longer bear the full weight of divine wrath. This covenant, not written with ink or carved in stone, was inscribed into the cycles of nature and the passage of time. God continued, as long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night, will never cease. This was a promise of stability, of the unchanging rhythm of the universe. From then on, The land would be a place for humanity to sow and reap, for seasons to follow one another, and for life to flourish endlessly. Spring would return, with newborn cries echoing across the land as generations walked upon the renewed earth. Noah looked to the heavens, his eyes filled with understanding of the profound significance of what had unfolded. The world had been cleansed, and from its ruins, a new beginning had emerged. The hills, still damp from the flood, began to sprout tender green shoots. Streams carved fresh paths, carrying life to every corner. A dove circled overhead, a sign of peace restored, while the distant calls of wildlife heralded the rebirth of creation. Noah and his family's first steps on this new earth were not those of victors but of survivors, chosen ones responsible for restoring the world. On the peak of Ararat, amidst the crisp wind and the golden sunlight, they began to walk, joining the resurgence of life. From the smoke rising from the altar, from the dove's wings, and the budding grass, God's promise was fulfilled. Though darkness may engulf the world, light will always return. As the earth remained damp with the breath of the great flood, and the last remnants of the old world were erased, a new world began to awaken in an eerie stillness. The land lay silent, waiting for the touch of new life, waiting for humanity to fulfill the mission entrusted to them by the Creator. Noah and his family, the sole survivors, stood on the dry ground, listening to the voice of God echoing through the expanse. This was not an ordinary voice but a divine decree, a promise and a great covenant for the chosen. God blessed Noah and his sons, saying, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth." These words rang like a bell, awakening life from its long slumber. The earth was no longer desolate and death-filled, but now a new land, a blank canvas awaiting the first lines of a new chapter in human history. But the blessing went beyond multiplication. It came with a mysterious power transfer. God said, "The fear and dread of you will fall on all the beasts of the earth." A profound shift occurred in the relationship between humanity and all living creatures. From that moment, all animals, birds of the air, beasts of the field, and sea fish would see mankind and tremble. They were no longer equals or adversaries, but were under humanity's dominion. Yet this fear was not born of cruelty, but from the divine authority bestowed upon humankind. Made in the image of God, everything that lives and moves will be food for you. From the green plants of the earth to all living creatures, everything was now given to humanity as sustenance, a sacred gift from the hand of the Creator. Yet, within this gift came a boundary, but you must not eat meat that has its lifeblood still in it. Blood, the essence of life and the soul of all creatures, was not to be violated. God reminded them that blood belonged to Him, and whoever shed the blood of another would be held accountable for their sin. "And for your lifeblood, I will surely demand an accounting." These words resounded like a chilling warning, a law both stern and just. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. Blood spilled on the earth cries out to the heavens. Humanity, created in the image of God, bore that sacred image, and anyone who defiled it would not escape judgment. This was divine justice, surpassing any human law. After these warnings, God reaffirmed His promise, "As for you, be fruitful and increase in number. Multiply on the earth and increase upon it." This was not merely a command, but a declaration of hope. The earth had been cleansed, and now humanity was to renew it, sowing seeds of life into its soil, fields, and forests. Then, a miraculous moment unfolded. God spoke to Noah and his sons. "I now establish my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature with you." This was not just a covenant with humanity, but with all creation, from the smallest birds of the sky to the mighty beasts of the field. from the creatures moving silently upon the earth to the fish swimming in the depths of the seas. This covenant was a promise that never again would a flood destroy all life on earth. But God did not stop with words. He provided an everlasting sign to seal his covenant. He said, "I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth." The rainbow was no natural phenomenon, but a sacred symbol of God's mercy and love. Whenever dark clouds gathered and rain fell, the rainbow would appear as a reminder that God would never forget his promise. The image was beautiful and profound. Amidst the stormy sky, a radiant rainbow appeared, a light bridge piercing through the darkness. Whenever I bring clouds over the earth, and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind. The rainbow was not only for God to remember his promise, but for humanity to look upon and etch into their hearts. It was a reminder that even though rain and clouds may darken the sky, destruction like the Great Flood would never return. The earth now belonged to life, to the hope that God had given to humanity and all creatures. Whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on the earth. These words echoed like a song of reconciliation, like the voice of heaven speaking to the earth. Noah and his family looked up at the sky, where the first rainbow stretched across the clouds, radiant and wondrous, like a bridge uniting heaven and earth. Noah's eyes reflected faith and gratitude as he realized the greatness of God's mercy, surpassing even his judgment. God was not only the judge, but the giver of hope and new beginnings. "This is the sign of the covenant I have established between me and all life on the earth." The rainbow would forever symbolize mercy and hope, a sacred sign that, from generation to generation, humanity would look upon and remember the unfading covenant between God and all creation. In the stillness of the renewed world, the rainbow lingered, a gentle light from heaven reminding all that God's love remains. Even in the darkest of skies, the new world after the Great Flood stretched out as a vast, silent emptiness, clean and pure like a blank sheet of paper. In this stillness, Noah and his family, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, walked upon the land, bearing the heavy burden of their role. They were the new beginning of humanity, the seed sown on soil cleansed by God's wrath. Noah's 3 sons were the great branches from which nations would spread across the earth, filling its valleys, mountains, and distant seas. Yet, amidst the blessings and light of this reborn world, a shadow crept into Noah's tent, weaving a tale of mystery and tragedy. Noah, a man of the soil, after fulfilling his mission to save the world, returned to the humble labor of a gardener. He planted a vineyard, a symbol of new life and prosperity in the scriptures. The vineyard flourished, its vines heavy with clusters of grapes, ripe and glistening like jewels filled with sweet nectar. From these grapes, wine was made, a miraculous drink that brought joy but also revealed human frailty and unvarnished truths. One day, Noah drank the wine from his vineyard and became intoxicated. In his drunken state, he fell into unconsciousness, freed from the burdens of worry and responsibility that had weighed on him. He lay naked in his tent, exposed in his vulnerability and humanity, a stark contrast to the man who had once walked with God and saved the human race. In this moment of mystery, Ham, Noah's second son and the father of Canaan, stumbled upon his father in his nakedness. Yet it was not merely the sight of Noah that mattered. Ham's gaze bore a lack of reverence, disregarding his father's dignity and sacred position. Rather than covering his father's shame or keeping the matter private, Ham left the tent and told his brothers, turning the incident into a mocking tale laden with disrespect. Ham's actions went beyond mere carelessness. They fractured the sacred bond between father and son, a bond ordained by God since the beginning. In an era where filial piety was the cornerstone of order and morality, exposing his father's shame was a grave sin. In stark contrast, Shem and Japheth acted with respect and discretion. Hearing Ham's tale, they neither joined in the mockery nor looked upon their father's humiliation. Instead, they took a cloak, draped it over their shoulders, and walked backward into the tent. They carefully avoided seeing their father's nakedness as they covered him, a quiet act of reverence and mercy, shielding what should not have been seen. When Noah awoke from his stupor, he realized what had happened. The shadow of Ham's disrespect lingered within the tent, and Noah, now fully aware, pronounced a curse in his righteous indignation. "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves. Will he be to his brothers?" Noah's curse did not fall directly on Ham, but upon his son, Canaan. Why was the curse passed to the next generation? Was this a reflection of divine justice, where the father's sins carried consequences for his descendants? Canaan, innocent in this moment, became the bearer of his father's transgression, a fate that bound his lineage to servitude. Yet Noah's words were not solely curses. He also blessed Shem and Japheth, the sons who had acted with respect. "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Shem. May Canaan be the slave of Shem. May God extend Japheth's territory. May Japheth live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be the slave of Japheth." Shem, who honored his father, was placed under God's protection, and from his lineage would come nations carrying divine promises and light. Japheth, who acted alongside Shem in reverence, was granted expansion and peace under Shem's shelter. But Canaan, Ham's lineage, would bear the burden of servitude, living under the dominion of his brother's descendants. Ham's small action created a rift in human history, a fracture filled with mystery and consequences that would echo for generations. Through this story, God reminded humanity of the sacredness of respect and honor and the weight of every action, no matter how small. Noah, who had carried the mission of renewing the world, lived 350 years after the flood. He witnessed his descendants spread across the earth, yet his blessings and curses did not fade with time. They reverberated through generations as a testament to the importance of respect and gratitude. When Noah passed in 950, the world he had saved had flourished. But the tale of Ham and the curse of Canaan endured, a shadow lingering amid the light of renewal. Noah's words were not merely immediate judgments, but also prophetic declarations about the future, a haunting reminder of the cost of irreverence and pride. On the renewed earth, amid the whispering winds through the vineyards, the story of Noah and his sons continued to echo. The blessings, the curse, and the bond between father and sons became a permanent thread in humanity's tapestry, a story that never rests in the collective memory of mankind. This is a profound reminder of human nature and existence in a fragile world balanced between judgment and mercy. Every small action, every glance, every word carries the power to shape not only one's destiny but also that of future generations. Life is a sacred gift, yet it is fraught with challenges. God has granted humanity not only dominion but also the responsibility to preserve and honor all that has been created. When reverence is lost, entire generations may bear the consequences. The world cannot be fully renewed as long as the shadows of sin linger within the human heart. Respect the sacred, uphold reverence, and remain mindful of your responsibility toward life and creation. Behind every trial, even those cloaked in destruction, lies an opportunity for humanity to rediscover itself and grow better. But do you have the courage to embrace that lesson? Please subscribe to our channel to enjoy more captivating Bible stories from us.